The first thing that comes to my mind when you ask about the suffering of good people is the Holocaust. The Holocaust is seen as the quintessential example of the suffering of good people, men, women, children, babies, killed in the most brutal, incomprehensible kind of ways by an industrialized modern society. And in fact, killing was done in an industrialized kind of factory. It was a factory of death, right? And so the Holocaust is problematic in a philosophical, on so many levels, but in a philosophical sense, specifically with this question of the suffering of good people and how God could have allowed such a thing. This branch of philosophy that deals with this kind of question is called theodicy. It comes from the Greek theo, meaning God, like if you've ever heard of the word theological, God, divine, divinity, theo, or theos, and viki, or we'd pronounce it diki, which is kind of related to the word judicial, D-I-C, and it means judgment, trial, and essentially theodicy, the branch of philosophy called theodicy, is a branch of philosophy that tries to justify God. Theodicy literally means the justification of God. And it judges God on various things, specifically on the suffering of good people, and asking about God's accountability in that. And I'd say there are two ways of answering this question, because there are multiple ways, and we can spend an endless amount of time talking about the notion of tzaddik v'ralo. Chazal tell us that Moshe Rabbeinu struggled with this. The entire book of Eov could be seen as a Theodosian book, a book on theodicy, tzaddik v'ralo, and there's a lot to be said on it. But there are two main aspects that I would address. The first one being God's accountability in the suffering of good people at the hands of man, which is essentially what the question of the Holocaust is, right? It was Hitler and the Nazis that perpetrated this evil, and the question of where God fits into that. And one very resonant and maybe extremist position that I'd like to talk about in the couple of minutes that I have here to talk. Again, this could be a very extended kind of discussion, is the view of Eliezer Berkovitz, who was a very well-known, prominent rabbi, theologian, philosopher on the Holocaust. And he wrote a book in the 1970s, maybe 1977, it was published, called Faith After the Holocaust. And he puts forth a very interesting way, or a very interesting version of the maybe typical argument, maybe you've heard this before, the notion that it wasn't God, it was Hitler, right? But he says it in a very poignant and very kind of profound kind of way. He says as follows in his book, Faith After the Holocaust. He describes God in Tanakh. He uses Tanakh as his basis. And he defines God as hidden. That one of the aspects of God is that God is the hidden one. God is the one who recedes. God is the one who withdraws, contracts himself from the world in a way, in order to allow humans to fill that world with everything that they are. God is defined as absent so that humans can be defined as present. And one of the main definitions of humanity, in Eliezer Berkovitz's estimation, is that we have the ability to think and be decision makers and decide between good and evil. And he describes the fact, he explains that if there was no evil in the world, we can never have something, we can never discern something as being good. If there was only good in the world and human beings chose good, it wouldn't really be a choice. We would just be really good robots, right? Because the only choice we had, the only option out there would be goodness. And if there was only evil in the world and we were evil, it would be just by virtue of the fact that that's our only option. So we'd be evil robots. But we wouldn't be human beings because we wouldn't be making decisions. In order to be decision-making entities, there have to be multiple options that we can decide from, right? So there's good and there's evil in the world, and human beings they maintain their humanity. What defines them in their humanness, what makes them human, is their ability to distinguish between and decide between good and evil. And so when God didn't bomb the tracks to Auschwitz or strike the gas chambers with lightning, he was essentially preserving the human ability to make the decision to build the tracks to Auschwitz and to build the gas chambers. Obviously, those being the decisions of the Nazis, right? If God was to have intervened in that, he would be essentially saying, I don't want human beings to make these decisions. I'm not allowing human beings to make these decisions. I'm going to make the decisions around here. I'm not going to give them the option of choosing evil. All that's going to exist in this world is going to be good, and I'm going to demand it. I'm not going to allow evil to persist. And the moment that he does that, according to Eliezer Berkovitz, the moment that he decides that human beings cannot make the decision, even if it means that they're sometimes going to be making the wrong decision and going to be perpetrating evil, the moment God does that, he destroys humanity. And so instead of seeing the Holocaust as the quintessential example of some kind of evil that God is capable of doing or is capable of withstanding, Eliezer Berkovitz sees the Holocaust as the quintessential example of how far God is willing to go to safeguard humanity. It's a really, really interesting way of viewing it. I mean, if there was a smaller example, if there was a case in which a bully was punching out a little kid in school, right? And God was to have withdrawn himself from that circumstance and say, you know what? I want humans to have free will. I want them to be decision makers. I want them. That's what makes them human, and I want humanity to persist. So I'm not going to intervene in that example. That would have been kind of small potatoes. We would have said, oh wow, Hashem really doesn't want to get involved. He wants us to be able to make decisions freely, right? Kal v'chomer, how much more so when God withdraws himself and restrains himself in the event of the Holocaust. That would be the example where God would say, no, enough. If this is what humanity is, if humanity is going to choose such evil, I'm not going to allow humanity to persist in this way, right? I'm going to intervene. God, even at that moment where you would expect him, where you would want him, where you would scream out to him, please, please intervene, God says, no, I can't. No matter what humans decide, I will not get involved. I will not intervene, because the moment I intervene is the moment I take away what makes them human. So the Holocaust is a really strong example in Eliezer Berkovitz's schema, in his philosophy of God. It's the extent to which God is willing to go to safeguard and preserve what actually makes us human. I mean, it's at a massive expense, obviously, because when he allows human beings to make decisions, they can make such horrific decisions. That's what the Holocaust shows us, how the expense, the damage that comes from God withholding himself. But God made this cost-benefit analysis and said, at the end of the day, I want humanity here, even if they're going to make such horrific decisions and they're going to behave so poorly. So when we think about Tzaddik v'Ralo, we think about the suffering of good people at the hands of other people. We can think about God's bystanding or his lack of intervention, him being on the sidelines, as a sign of how much he loves us, that he wants humans to still survive and still be here, still be around, even though they will sometimes, and maybe even too often nowadays. Although this is not the Holocaust was not the only genocide, and it's not the only evil that human beings have perpetrated in the history of the world. God says, nevertheless, I want them here. And so I'm going to remove myself.